When the sky over Mordor tore like a wound and a light fell into the ash, the dark eye turned and found a new flame, not of Middle-earth, but of a stranger who rose laughing from a place of suns. Men felt the old dread and a new wonder at once, for where he stood the air sang with a power the world had never known. So it was told afterward in whispers by those who survived the shadow, and in songs by those who outlived it, that in the season when the land seethed and all eyes were bent upon a single, terrible will, a breach rent the vault of heaven above the blackened plain. The rift was not like a star's birth nor like a thundercrack. It was as if the very seam of the world had been unwoven, and a brightness, hard as the core of a comet, slid through. Around the rent the smoke recoiled as though the world itself had drawn breath, and from that brightness there stepped a figure unshadowed by the ash. He was not garbed as any that dwell in Arda. His raiment was of an orange more pure than autumn fire, bound by a sash that looked like sunset. His hair stood as if struck by lightning, black and stubborn, and his face bore the iron-simple joy of a man who has fought hunger and learned laughter in the same hour. He laughed aloud upon the blasted ground, and his voice was like a bell struck with sunlight. The sound courted the wind until even the mountains seemed to lean and listen. Around him, the very air vibrated. Blades of grass along distant borders trembled though they were long turned to ash, and the black stones of Mordor heaved as if in answer to some inner motion. Those who had eyes to see and courage to look named him at first in 100 ways. An envoy of the valor, a Starsent Maya, a mortal sprung from the west. Yet none of these names did him justice. He moved with a grace that mocked war, yet with the strength of a breaker. Where he walked the dust rose and fell like applause. Great birds wheeled and fell, silent wolves fled. The shrieks of orcs, too, were stilled, for they felt in their marrow a force that was not fear alone, but the pricklings of a new dominion. The eye, that lidless vigilance that sat above the tower of Barad-dûr, turned upon this light. It had watched the west and counted the years of men. It had felt in its black desire the pull of the ring when it lay unknown, and the soft direction of wills that bent and broke before its command. Now it regarded a brightness that was not woven of deceit nor of the old malice. The dark will recoiled, and then sharpened its perception. It sent forth its thoughts like cold needles into the brightness, to know its nature and to bend it to its purpose. The stranger, smiling still, felt the pricking and looked up. There are in this world, the wise say, forces older than names, and some of them answer to simplicity. The stranger raised neither staff nor sign. He raised a single hand, palm open to the eye as though to hail a sun. There was no quail of spirit, rather. A curious warmth ran through him as if a hearth had been set aflame within his chest. The eye blinked, an action that in its being was a theft of many things. It had not known such a response before. To see the look was to feel the strain of wills, and the dark will, if not amused, was at least intrigued. From the fissure came not only a man but a likeness of other suns, shapes and light too swift and bright for the common ken. Strange companions, small metal things, coils of brightness, hung for a moment and then vanished as if shy. No harp of elves or drum of Gondor could have borne such music as the stranger's coming made. It was the music of motion, of muscles set loose, of the world delighted by its own capacity to move. In the south of Ithilien, the rangers watched the sky and did not know if it was omen or pestilence. Aragorn, son of Arathorn, who had learned to read the portents of war as others read letters, felt a tightening in his heart as he saw the new light. Beside him were men who had eyes like hounds and courage like oak. They knew the mark of the enemy, and they knew also the things they did not know. A thing from beyond, whispered one, and the name of stranger sat like a stone between them. Aragorn's voice, when he spoke, was of a man who bears many burdens. Let no man be hasty. If a new power come, we shall see whether it is as friend or fiend far to the west, in Rivendell. Elrond's ministers felt the tremor of the world seem being touched. Even Gandalf the Grey, who had many arts and had seen many comings, paused and frowned beneath his bristling brows. Magic old and cunning, he felt, had little to say of the stranger's regard. This was not a weaving that he could read with the lore in his staff. It was simpler, fiercer, and yet as reckless as a child's fist. He muttered words none would write in the histories of men. He walked toward the red moss and the shadowed lands, as if drawn by a cord. The servants of Sauron were the first to answer in force. The Nazgul rose like a knight upon the plain, their cries a blade that cut through the laughter. They were cloaked in sorrow's fashion and armed with terror, with hoofs that snuffed hope from the earth. Their leader, the Witch King, rode like a cataract of doom and turned the darkness into a spear. Wherever their wings beat, the light paled as a hand smears out a lamp. They sought the stranger, to bring him bound before the eye or to rend him where he stood, for anything that drew the eye's notice, and yet laughed was an affront that must be answered. The stranger looked upon them as one might regard small, hungry dogs. He extended his palms, and in the valley of ashes a wind gathered that smelled not of rot but of clean, sharp metal. The Nazgul were halted, not by fear of him, but by bewilderment. They felt themselves as if their binding cords were loosened and twisted. One came forward, all the more hasty for its ancient malice, and the stranger met it. What happened when iron met that unaccountable force is told in many tongues, but the truth was simple and terrible. The ground quivered, and a sound like a drum of many skins struck once and then unmade itself. The Nazgul was flung as if by a giant's palm. Its mount reared and broke like a reed. On the plain, the scratch of orc vices rose into a wail. The stranger's feet did not leave the dust seemingly, yet the wind answered him as if his will commanded tides. He stooped to set a small round thing that glinted darker than coal upon the ground, and though none there knew it by sight, they felt its weight. It was the one ring that lay, in that telling, upon a black stone. Whether it had been cast thither by chance, or by the long and secret devices of fate, or by the reaching hands of the eye itself, is something the wise will argue until the last days. The ring hummed faintly, like a wasp in old cloth. Around it the light bent and shivered. The shadows recoiled in that small circle. Sauron's will, like a tide, rose within the eye and sought the ring's voice. The Nazgul, though scattered, rallied as if the thought of recovery steadied them. They came with the hunger of long servitude. The stranger paused. He smiled, and the smile was simple as bread and twice as honest. He reached out, not with cunning, nor with bargaining, but with curiosity. The hand that came to take the ring was neither gaunt nor greedy. It trembled not. For a moment time hung like a curtain between winter and spring. The eye flared as if to swallow the hand and the ring together, to draw both into its blackness. The wind shrieked. Orcs fell silent, as if listening for a bell that might toll the world's end. Men and elves and Dunedain, and even the watchful in their towers, held their breath. Here upon the ash the story of the world might be turned. If that hand took the ring and bent to Sauron, the doom of many ages would be nigh. If the hand shattered it at one stroke, then perhaps a new tale would be sung where sorrow had been the only refrain. The stranger's eyes were very plain, very bright. They held none of the art of kings, nor the counting cold of tyrants. They held the open astonishment of wakefulness. He fitted the ring upon his finger as one adjusts a ring to a new friend, and felt within it a thing like a shadow reaching for warmth. Where other hearts had thrummed with the ring's temptation, his beat like a drumbeat of battle, steady, eager, not for dominion but for a fight. In that instant Sauron felt something that he had not felt since first forging the one, a challenge from the unlikeliest of quarters. as if a child had lifted a stone and found beneath it a sleeping wolf that rose and snarled the world, listening, leaned forward. Aragorn's fingers tightened upon his sword. Gandalf's staff hummed low. Elrond's eyes clouded with visions of possibilities. The Nazgul reassembled into a shadow so dense that it ate at light. From Barad-dûr a voice like the grinding of millstones poured out, full of threat and promise both. Yet the stranger still stood smiling, the ring upon his finger, and laughed as if at a private joke. His laughter rolled over the plain and fell into the cup of the eye like water cooled upon burning iron. So was the first meeting of a flame not of this world, and the shadow that had long desired to cloak the world. The histories say that on that day the very stones of Mordor remembered heat that was not of fire nor of earth, that the air tasted of spring, when spring was a word forgotten there, that even the least of things, moss in hidden clefts, the bones beneath the soil, lifted at the throb of a newly kindled life. No one knew then whether the stranger would be the world's undoing or its salvation, or some sorrowful mixture of both. But the tale opened like a crack in an old book, and all who looked saw that what came through was not merely might but a mirthless, terrible courage that had the hardness of steel and the levity of a child's shout. Thus ended the first day of the stranger's coming, and thus the first pages of a tale that would be told in many tongues. The eye turned, the dark will pondered, and the stranger, this singular child of suns, faced the shadow with laughter and a strange, unarmored hand upon the thing that had long enslaved kings. He came without trumpets, without banner or heraldry. He came as a thing of light and motion, as a shattered star that had chosen to put down roots upon a field of green. Where he first set foot, the grass did not wither but bent as if in greeting. Where his shadow fell, the air thrummed like a harpstring. Men and beasts alike drew back with that old mixture of fear and worship that men show to things beyond their ken. The company that watched him, for there were those already on the road who had ears quick to news, stood hushed upon a rise and let the great silence grow. Even the trees of the lone wood seemed to lean, listening. He spoke little. His language was not of the tongues of the West, yet there was kindness in his voice, and a bluntness that seemed more honest than many subtle speeches heard in the courts of lords. He called no man master, and took no oath. He laughed at peril, and ate with the appetite of those who have need of nothing from pride. Rumor would run quicker than the truth, and fashion for itself 100 names. A wanderer, a weapon of the sky, a son of the stars. Yet those who met him saw something else, a simplicity that was not ignorance, a hunger for challenge that was not cruelty. When he bent his head to a child, he did it as a king might to a comrade. When he struck a beast, it was to spare suffering. And when he fought, he made art of movement, and mercyward went, as it will in troubled times, to uneasy ears, to the fires of the men of the West, to the listening halls of the elves, to the gray towers of the Astari, came these strange tidings, that a stranger who walked like a king but had the laughter of a boy had landed, that his power bent the air like heat, and that around him the darkness itself seemed to whisper. Men wore the news like a mantle, some warmed to it, wanting hope, others drew close in suspicion. For Middle-earth had learned that wonder may be a bait. Gandalf, who had walked many roads, watched with eyes that had seen the rising of stars and the falling of tyrants. He felt upon his bones the tremor of an odd and old power. It was not the power of the valor, nor the echo of their music. Yet it struck some chord in the world, as if from a farther music beyond the sea. He took counsel with Aragorn and with Legolas and Gimli, for the road to Mordor lay heavy with decisions. The stranger was nearer the land of shadow than any born of that soil had ever been unbidden. To leave such a force unmarked would be to tempt fate. To seek it out might be to set flame to tinder. They found him at dawn, upon a hill that looked eastward. He had slept beneath the sky, a sleeping thing who turned upon his side like a child. Around him sat a small circle of folk, some farmers, a woman with eyes like winter winds, a young huntsman who had seen dwarves and counted himself lucky, and even a pony that had once belonged to a rout of travelers. They told of the night when the stars fell, and how the stranger came blazing and laughing, and how he had helped when wolves troubled a fold, of how he had faced a troll with nothing but his bare hands and left it lying as if transfigured. Their voices trembled with wonder, with fear confounding it, and in that trembling Gandalf heard a note familiar and terrible, the shape of change. "What is it that he seeks?" Aragorn asked, and the answer came like a blade turned in the hand. "He seeks battle," said Legolas, watching the sleeping stranger with his elven sight. "Not war for dominion, but the joy of fight. I have looked upon him in my mind. His strength is like the tempest and his heart like a plain. There is no guile in him." Gimli spat upon the earth in disdain of praise. "A hulking fellow who flings men like stones. I would welcome him to the depths of a mine to see if his metal stands the test. Yet I do not like that his power sings in a tongue all its own." Gandalf's beard stirred in the morning wind. "Power unswayed by malice is a sharp thing in lands where much is old and hungry. Sauron will be quick to sense such ripeness. The enemy is cunning, he does not need iron swords to strike. He has a far needle of will that finds what he requires as a wolf finds lambs." As if called by that word, a shadow passed over the sun, and the earth seemed suddenly thin. From the blackness of the east came a sense like intent made visible. It was not yet the luminous eye that men had learned to dread, but a widening focus, as if a great mind had turned and set its attention. Orc drums sounded far off. Ragged and uneven riders moved in silence like the approach of rot. The stranger woke at that breath, sat up, and smiled as one smiles at the coming of an old rival. He rose with the easy motion of one who had no thought to yield. He wore no armor, and his garments were not fashioned in the style of any folk. He carried nothing but a small satchel and the imprint of many journeys upon his hands. When he looked eastward, the very birds seemed to pause in their flight. "Ah," he said, "more friends to meet." They came then, like a tide of iron and malice poured from a broken forge. Riders in black cloaks on monstrous beasts rode as if the night bore them. Their faces were shrouded, their banners were the shape of a thing unmade, and upon their heads gleamed the pale, leering lamps of the Nazgul. Their horses' breath steamed, and where they passed the grass blackened and the leaves withered. They had smelled of foreign power and came as dogs to scent a stranger's blood. The stranger laughed and uncoiled himself as if from a spring. He moved with such speed that the first striker who reached him saw only a flash and found himself tumbling upon the ground, his spear like splinters. The others leapt forward, a wall of hatred, but each was met with a wind that bent and an impact that did not kill so much as disarm. His hands were a blur, his footfalls hummed like the strings of a harp. He struck not to maim, but to end the fight swift and clean. Where he touched the earth it did not gape, but rather took new music into itself and sang in little pulses. The Nazgul recoiled, not simply at pain, but at something older and worse. They sensed in him an absence of fear, and fear is the food of servants who are fashioned from it. One of them, bolder than the rest, hurled down a voice that was like the scraping of iron. "Yield him," it cried, and from its tone came the insinuation of commands, the will of a master pressing upon a slave. The stranger turned his head and looked as a man might look at a nettle, with a small and amused pity. "No," he said. The word was simple. It carried no charm, no magic. It had the weight of a stone guttural, and clear the Nazgul's shriek tore like metal from a furnace. Winged things that had been corvids and ravens rose from the trees, drawn to the scent of dark power, and what had been the evening brightened into battle. The stranger's hair rose slightly, electric as a field touched by lightning. and from his palms there flowed a radiance that was neither elven light nor the soft glow of the stars, but something piping hot and golden, as if the sun itself had been caged within his hands, and then offered in play. It touched men and beasts, and made them leap back from themselves. The enemies fell, not by the slow travail of siege and blade, but as fruit falls from a tree at the strike of a sudden frost. Where the stranger's power brushed, the glamour of the Nazgul balked, and something in their shrouds hissed like coals in a draught. One of the riders, thrown from its mount, crawled and beat upon the stranger with fists that bled. The stranger only laughed and set him down with the gentleness of a father putting a sleeping child upon a bed. "Why do you fight thus?" asked Aragorn, for in all his years he had seen noble fighters and fell tyrants, but never hands that struck with such contradictory tenderness. "You waste no thought upon yielding, yet you do not crush." The stranger looked toward Aragorn, and something like a new light passed over his face, as if he recognized in the ranger a kindred hunger. For a life free of cunning, for a challenge worthy of a man. "I fight because I like it," he said. Simply, and because there are bullies who need slapping. Gandalf allowed himself a small, rare smile. "There is that," he said. Yet his old heart quickened. The power the stranger wielded was not merely force, but something the Astari had seen once in the music of the world, a fierce and radiant joy that defied corruption. If such joy could be turned, it would break a man if it remained whole. It might overturn the will of a tyrant. The Nazgul retreated into the gloom, carrying the scent of a scalding and unfamiliar wind. Their shrieks became words of counsel on some dark tongue, and soon the shadow that had fallen over the hill wavered like heat above a stone, then fled back east like a thing that had been stung. The gear of the enemy scraped and rasped in the distance. Their leaders would have heard the report and gone to meet it with other means. This was no trifling loss, but a wound upon the pride of Sauron, who kept watch like a hawk over his dominion. That hawk would not forget. After the battle there was quiet, and men and hobbits who had gathered at the periphery moved to tend the wounded, to set down those who had been thrown. The stranger sat upon a stone, smiling like someone who had merely had a good match. Frodo, who had seen more than a hobbit's share of dark things, approached with that terrible caution that had become his habitude. "Are you a Maya?" he ventured. It was a foolish question, for he could see no garment of the kind worn by the Valar's servants. Still, it was asked from a wish. Frodo, who bore a burden that sang always at the edges of temptation, hoped against hope that this might be another kind of help. The stranger looked at him with eyes as wide as simple faith. "Not a Maya, not of your making. I come from far away, from a world that sings a different tune. But if you need a friend, I will stand. If you need a fight, I will stand. And if you need a bit to eat, I am quite hungry." There was something disarming in his candor, and in that moment a small trust formed like a sprout through cracked stone. The strangers, the weary, the brave, all gathered about and found themselves lightened. They laughed, for laughter is a stubborn medicine. Yet Gandalf's gaze did not soften for long. He looked to the east and felt the turning of gears that had been set by a will older and blacker than the lands. Sauron, upon his dark throne, had senses stretched over stone and smoke. He would have felt the sting of his servants and the strange radiance that had cut them. He would also, like serpent sensing a hand, seek to turn that radiance or crush it. The question was no longer whether the stranger could win a game of strength. The deeper, older question burned like coals. Would the presence of this foreign might unmake or save the fragile thread upon which all hung? So it was decided that they must move, for to stand would invite a storm, and to hold the stranger as a secret would be folly. Aragorn would take a small company and guide him south. Gandalf would ride ahead and sound the towers, and the wood Legolas and Gimli would go as well. For where one blade rings true, another may dull. Frodo and Sam, whose pilgrimage bore the weight of other danger, would keep their counsel. The land shivered with portents, and men set forth bearing hope like a lamp into the wind. The stranger rose at once. He stretched as a great cat and bounded, and those who walked with him were made light by his presence as by a sudden dawn. Yet always, in Gandalf's mind, there was the cold impression of an unseen set of eyes. Sauron would not remain idle. He had lost minions to a stranger, and that sting would awaken something like wrath in him. The Dark Lord's will would gather, and the ring that he had forged, the One Ring, which bent hearts and whispered like a lover, had a voice that would find fresh timbre in the presence of one so unlike any to whom it had spoken. If the stranger proved to be a sword that could cut the chain of that voice, then the age of shadow might end. But if he proved mortal to its guile, if he listened to honeyed counsel and let himself be led, then doom might wear a new face, bright and laughing, before it killed. Gandalf thought of the ring upon Frodo's hand, of the smallness of the hobbit's will and the vast weight upon it. He thought of the stranger's laughter and light, and felt the world tilt between two possible endings. He prayed, in a language older than any tongue in which words were more than hope, that in the coming days the strange power they had touched would remain as it seemed, unbought, unbent, and true the road south lengthened, and the smoke of the enemy curled upon the horizon like an omen. The stranger walked at their side, and told them tales of skies with no moon and mountains that burned like rubies in return. They taught him the names of trees, and how to tie a knot, and the lithe art of wayside courtesy. It was a strange fellowship, and yet it was fellowship. Each in it wore the world's old marks, and each would in time be tested by the forging fires that lay ahead. For beyond the next ridge lay not only armies but the eye of the world itself, and somewhere within that watchful dark, the One Ring waited, small and relentless, to try the hearts of those who would stand against it. A silence fell that was not the silence of peace, but the hush of a sky struck mute. For a moment all sound was wrung from the world. The rasping wings of the fell beasts, the clink of armor on the plains, the murmurs and prayers in hidden places, and even the black wind that came from Mordor seemed to pause as if listening. Where the One Ring had lain, no longer a bright jewel of ensorcelled will, but a thing broken and bleeding light. There was a spreading radiance that was not of elvencraft nor of the light of men. It shone like day harvested from an alien sun, clear and terrible, and it made the very stones sing with a new language Sauron's gaze. If that proud and vast malice could be said to have gazed when it had been flung outward upon armies and upon fear, recoiled as a hawk from lightning. The Dark Lord's throne, which had been a blackless, a pinnacle of iron and shadow above the plain, trembled as if a new world had been set upon it. A voice, not uttered but poured forth like lead and smoke, went through the ranks of his servants. A curse, a command, a terrible laughter like crumbling towers. The Nazgûl shrieked and reared, their helms turned to the light, their riders lost as if pulled by chains to the abyss. From the very rift where the ring had burst, a figure walked forth, not clad in mail or robed in the fashions of Middle-earth, but naked to the weathering of battle, as is the custom of those wrought of different cosmos. He was not tall in the measure of the valor, nor small as rustic hobbits. He stood with shoulders square as a far-off mountain, and with eyes that were keen as a hunter's. Strange hair stood about his head like a flame blown upward. His skin bore the sheen of one long of campaign beneath a foreign sun. Around him there hung an aura that the wise could not name, for it had no kin in their lore, a breathing of pure force that seemed to answer neither to the singing of elves nor to the works of wizards. He strode forward, and the plain before Barad-dûr took on the aspect of a theater. Men faltered upon the pike, their courage melting into stories they would never live to tell. Elves, who had long memory and long sight, felt their old songs twist into a new key. The dwarves gripped their axes and muttered of deep heat and divisions beneath stone, for they perceived in that presence the echo of contests older than mounting craft. Even those who had been bound to Sauron's will by Ringlus staggered, for their chain was struck loose by something neither sword nor oath could hold. The stranger's gaze found the ruin of the ring, and then, with a swiftness like a bird loosed, swept the bastions of Mordor. He did not speak at first. Where words would have been expected, there came a sound like a bell in the far-off sea, not bell of metal, but a bell of some living thing, deep and clear, and it thrummed in the bones. To those who had stood at the edges of doom and believed themselves bereft, hope, that fragile and perilous thing, rose and took shape. It was not the hope taught by prophecy or by song. It was the hope of a child who is given a sword. Sudden, hot, and terribly bright Sauron gathered himself as a storm gathers its thunder. The Dark Lord had long lived by drawing the wills of others into his own, and even now he tried his old arts, throwing forth commands to his lesser lords, bidding the Nazgul sweep in a circle of flame, bidding the legions of orc and warg to close like the teeth of a trap. But the commands faltered. The very air refused to carry them. They dissolved as vapor before they reached the ears of those called. Where once the black breath had sown dread and paralysis, now there rose an answering force, no mere absence of fear, but a pressing outward current of power that made Sauron's will the smaller thing. The first blow that changed the tide was not struck by sword or by spear. The stranger moved with a swiftness that set the hills whirling. He leapt as one might leap from thought to deed, and with his palm he closed upon the dark column of Sauron's power that streamed from Barad-dûr as a black river. He did not catch it as a hunter might snare a fish, rather he met it as the sea meets a storm, with a lifting, an answering surge. A sound like the breaking of a great bell broke upon the field, and from that contact came a light that cut through the perpetual dusk of Mordor, as if a great lamp had been set upon the black battlements. Those nearest felt their blood run hot and metallic. Some fell to their knees, not in worship, but in a strange gratitude for the end of a long, long night. Sauron roared then, and what was heard was the grinding of the world's bones. He sent forth his might, not in bodies now, but in lines of flame and needle-sharp shadow meant to pierce mind and flesh. The stranger rose into the air and met that hatred. He was no wizard of the West. His power answered not to incantation, nor to ringcraft. It was the raw, fierce sovereignty of one who had trained to wrestle with destiny itself. From his palms sprang light like comets. He took the dark like a gardener takes a weed, pulling it from the earth with hands used to gentleness and to precision. It was not the manner of Sauron's undoing that the wise had reckoned. There was no slow ebbing, no final unfurling of hidden doom. There was a collision, a titanic, quick and dreadful meeting of forces that rent the air and cast shadows like great ships across the plains. Where the stranger struck, iron bent as if it were wax and fell away to lay bare the true shape of things. Orcs dissolved into smoke, and the fell beasts screamed as the new light seared their wings. Yet for all the damage he brought, the stranger did not move with malice but with a curious sorrow, as if each blow cost him something that lay within him. From the highest watch upon the hill near the field, one who loved Middle-earth with a fierceness that had no name cried out. Sons of men and the rangers of the north, who had followed the strangers coming with grim hope, surged forward. Aragorn, if he stood, felt his lineage keenly as he saw before him a champion utterly unlike any who had been forged by their laws and ages. He would have known fear in another hour, but now he knew that this being fought not to rule but to unmake a master. And for such intent, all courage's men Gandalf, who had known much of strange visitors and old enemies, felt in that light a pattern of power that was both simple and unfathomable. He muttered words at the edge of hearing, old words to steady the world, and found them supported rather than commanded. The stranger answered none of his calls, for his cause and the wizards were alike in aim though diverse in nature, and there need be no concord of language between those whose hearts are set upon the same truth. As the duel of presences swelled, Sauron's form coalesced like a mountain of shadow, tremendous and awful. He lashed with all the bitterness of an ancient tyrant losing his prize. From the broken fragments of the ring, there leaped sparks that were like the eyes of old kings, each flicker a temptation to grasp and rule anew. The stranger's hands closed about those sparks, and they grew so small that even the Nazgul shrank from them. He seemed to use them as lanterns, to see not the world of men but a horizon beyond the world's end. There came a moment, brief as breath but heavy with consequence, when both the stranger and Sauron stilled, as if the earth itself waited to weigh their next movement. In that heartbeat, the air shimmered and shapes that had been hidden peeled themselves from the margins. The valor in their distant halls, high and far, might have known the vibration. The Maiar who had taken pity upon Middle-earth stiffened in their wandering and turned their faces a little. Elves clasped hands and sang an involuntary, thin note of old lament, while men felt in their throats the salt of a nameless dread and the taste of possible deliverance. Then the stranger spoke, or, more precisely, he let a warmth like a sunray fall upon the world. His voice was not like the voices of those who weave words into spells. It was, instead, the plain and stubborn instrument of a heart that had through many trials learned to be honest. He spoke of no kingdoms he would found, no crowns he would set upon the brows of the weary. He vowed, in tones that the grave and the joyous might both comprehend, to unmake the yoke that had been set upon the peoples. There was no boast, but there was an unquenchable resolve. Sauron answered with a sound that was like slate breaking, and then hurled himself at the stranger with a finality that would have crushed mountains. The field buckled under their conflict, grasses were wrung to dryness, and the sky seemed to burn. In that furious exchange, the stranger's form changed. Where once he had been only man-like, now there flared an apparition of endless battles. He became like a host claimed into single body, a multitude made one. Elven sight, sharpened by age, perceived within him a myriad of years and combats, as if he carried on his shoulders the lessons of other worlds. Yet beneath that host-likeness was a singular soul whose laughter and sorrow were his alone. The blow that struck Sauron was not a blow of hatred, but a stroke of necessary force. It cleaved the Black Lord's outer semblances, unbounding the ensnaring threads he had spun. The very armor of evil cracked and peeled away like scorched bark. With each rupture, a cry went up from the captives of the rings. The Nazgul shrank in their regal misery, unmade their garments until they were but shrieks and naked wraiths bereft. The darkness that had poured from Barad-dûr thinned and grew threadbare until it was merely smoke. Yet even as ruin visited Sauron, the stranger did not exult. He bore in his eyes the knowledge that to break a chain is one thing, and to heal the wound it leaves is another. Around the places where the ring's shadow had lain were blisters in the land, hollows that the hands of men could not fill. The stranger touched those places with fingers of light and whispered into them not commands but benisons, old words of mending that had no name in Middle-earth's tongues. The land drank and healed slowly, like a throat warmed after fever. When at last the dark thing that had been Sauron shrank and shivered like a dying colossus, the field lay quiet in the new light of a strange dawn. The stranger sank to one knee and looked upon those who remained. Some were whole, some were dust or smoldering ruin. Around him gathered the living as moths might cluster to a lantern, wary, reverent, and not without fear. He did not make claim over them, nor did he ask for tribute. He only reached out with hands that had made and unmade many things and gathered the fallen where he could, laying them gently upon the grass. His touch warmed like hearthfire. His aura softened to a golden humility. For a moment time itself hung, and then the peoples of Middle-earth, who had been hollowed and hardened by centuries of dread, stepped forward. They asked questions in many tongues, of where he came from, what name he bore, by what right he had wrought such things. He answered not with names, but with a tale of a road that leads beyond the edges of the world, and of an oath taken because some truths are older than law. He told them that the ring, though shattered, had left a stain, and that to cleanse it would be a work for many hands and a long time. He spoke of leaving too, for he was a stranger whose destiny lay in paths other than those of this earth. Gandalf, with eyes like a flame under gray cloud, approached him and bowed as one does to an elder of a foreign hall. Words passed between them, not loud but deep, and in that small converse there lay the understanding of those who have watched many ages. The stranger nodded once, a tiny thing, and rose. He looked long upon the ruined tower, upon the burnt fields, and upon faces that would henceforth carry the weight of tales. Then, without trumpets or lament, he turned and walked to the rim of the world where the sky thins behind him. From the depths of Mordor, small flames of rebellion began to kindle among the greater fires of ruin. Men took up what they could, and elves sang low, for songs are salves. The dwarves brooded on the shapes of stones, and the rangers watched with foreheads seamed with the knowledge that peace is a fragile and treacherous thing. The stranger paused once at the ridge and, with a gesture that was both farewell and benediction, let his light melt into the morning. A wind rose then, a wind unbound by the designs of Sauron, and it carried with it seeds of a future not yet written. Thus the stranger from beyond the world left Middle-earth changed. He had not come to rule nor to wed himself to its ages, but to rend one terrible thing and to set the first stones for the long labor of healing. In the hollowed spaces where the ring's shadow had lain, new gardens would be planted, and songs would rise that told of a time when a foreign hand unmade a tyrant. In the courts of men and in the halls of elves, his story would be told and retold, painted in different colors but keeping the same heart. That in the blackest hour a spark from a far sun came and struck the fetters loose, and that the world, though wounded, still had owners who would not yield.